In a quiet countryside village where wildflowers danced in the fields and sunlight painted the rooftops gold, a woman named Mirelle stood at the edge of her new life. It was her wedding day, a union between her and Alaric, the eldest son of the House of Velander, a noble family known for their estates, influence, and cold civility. She was the daughter of a blacksmith and a school teacher, raised on values of honesty, grit, and quiet kindness. The reception was held in the Velanders' estate gardens, a sprawling expanse of trimmed hedges and crystalline fountains. Lanterns floated above the guests, bathing the night in a soft, ethereal glow. Musicians played delicate tunes on wooden instruments, and a feast of wild game, honeyed bread, and summer wine stretched across ornate tables. Mirelle smiled, that careful, rehearsed smile, the kind a woman perfects when navigating foreign territory. Her gown shimmered in the torchlight, but her heart beat unevenly. It had been a long journey to this day, love letters sent by candlelight, whispered dreams under starlit skies, and the merging of two impossibly different worlds. Then, it happened. Alaric's father, Lord Gavrion Velander, stood with his goblet raised, the firelight catching the silver in his beard. To the bride, he said, pausing just long enough for the silence to press in, may her time here be profitable. The crowd chuckled, mostly his side. The nobles with their velvet cloaks and jeweled fingers. Even Alaric, her beloved, laughed. Oh, come now, he added with a boyish grin, she married up, didn't she? The laughter was louder this time, and it pierced deeper. Mirelle's stomach tightened. She gripped her goblet, not drinking, only focusing on the way the wine shimmered like blood in the moonlight. Her smile remained, frozen, hiding the sting. The air felt thick with unspoken truths. She wasn't one of them. No matter how deeply she loved Alaric, to them, she was still a curiosity, a peasant girl who dared to breach the gates of the noble world. The whispers began. Did you see the way she walks? Too poised for a village girl. She must be here for the inheritance. They didn't know she had sold her family heirlooms to fund parts of the wedding, that her dowry was earned through years of hard work and quiet savings. They didn't see the ink stains on her fingers from transcribing village records to earn coin. They didn't know how many nights she soothed Alaric's doubts when he feared his family would disown him. And Alaric. He didn't look at her. He had already turned toward his cousin, laughing at some joke, leaving her there in the echo of their amusement. But not all eyes held scorn. Across the garden, a figure stood beneath the lanterns, Uncle Tavrin, her mother's brother. A retired knight and quiet soul, he watched with furrowed brows and tightened jaw. And then, he moved. He stepped forward, no fanfare, and gently tapped the edge of the dessert plate with his knife. A delicate chime echoed across the garden. The music faltered. Conversations stopped. All eyes turned. Does the bride wish to speak? Tavrin's voice, though calm, carried over the hush like a steady wind. Mirelle blinked. Her breath caught. Her fingers twitched. She hadn't prepared for this. She hadn't intended to fight back. But then she remembered the satchel tucked inside the embroidery of her cloak, a parchment inside, sealed with wax and embossed with her sigil. It was the deed. Not to land from the Velanders, but to the cottage she and Alaric now lived in. A cottage she bought. The world slowed. Every heartbeat felt like a drum against her ribs. No, she thought. They don't get to define me. And with that, Mirelle rose, not in rage, but in resolution. Her slippers pressed softly into the grass, but the silence behind her was thunderous. She did not look to Alaric, nor to Gavrion. She walked steadily toward the lantern-lit platform near the musicians. The villagers who had traveled to witness her wedding held their breath. The nobles whispered again, this time not with mockery, but uncertainty. Something in her posture unnerved them. As Mirelle approached the speaking stand, Tavrin stepped aside. He didn't speak again, only nodded, the kind of nod a soldier gives when offering his shield. She stood tall, her silhouette outlined by the moon. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but it didn't waver. Thank you all, she said, for joining us in this celebration of love. A pause. Confused glances. Smiles returned to faces that thought the moment had passed. But then she reached into her cloak and pulled out the deed. This, she continued, is the ownership of the home Alaric and I live in, purchased with coin I earned over many seasons, through hands chapped with work and nights spent poring over ink and ledgers. The crowd fell still. I did not marry into wealth, she said. I brought my own. I did not arrive here seeking status. I offered love, freely, fiercely. She looked at Gavrion. I do not need your approval to belong. I have built my own place. And I will not be laughed away from it. A sharp gust moves the lanterns above. Somewhere, a glass slipped from a hand. And just like that, the garden was no longer laughing. Before the lanterns. Before the silk gown. Before the hushed whispers and silver-spoon stares, there was the forge. Mirelle grew up in a stone cottage near the edge of a woodland hamlet called Aldercrest, a place where the seasons spoke in colors, and life moved at the pace of hands and harvest. Her father, Bram, was the village blacksmith, and her mother, Elena, was a school teacher who taught children beneath a wide-armed oak at the village center. Mirelle spent her youth with soot under her nails, parchment tucked under her arm, and dreams tucked deeper still, not of riches, but of more. More room to breathe. More choices. More truth. Their family was poor in coin, but not in dignity. Every meal was earned. Every object mended. They reused ribbons, stitched torn cloaks, and once even turned a broken wheelbarrow into a bookshelf. To them, survival wasn't shameful. It was sacred. By 17, Mirelle had taught herself numbers, letters, and how to speak to merchants without flinching. She worked odd jobs, copying legal documents for the town scribe, helping her father file accounts for his forge. And all the while, she saved. Not for baubles or finery, but for ownership, a place of her own. When she turned 28, she bought a modest parcel of land beyond the river bend. It had no manor, no vineyards. Just an old cottage with good bones, an apple tree out front, and windows that caught the sunrise. It was hers. And then, she met him. Alaric Velander arrived in Aldercrest during the summer of his family's estate expansion. He came under the pretense of surveying land, but what he truly sought was escape. His noble world, with its perfumed parties and obligation-laced politics, had begun to feel like a gilded cage. They met by accident. Mirelle was arguing with a tax collector about a clerical error that had doubled her yearly land dues. Her voice was sharp, her patience thin. Alaric stood nearby, intrigued by the fire in her tone. He stepped in, offered assistance, and to her surprise, actually listened. He didn't try to talk over her. He didn't condescend. And when she eventually got the tax issue corrected on her own, he applauded, genuinely. That was the beginning. They met again. And again. Long walks through the forest paths. Conversations by the creek. He read her journals. She corrected his assumptions. He spoke of courtly life with weary detachment. She spoke of hers with unpolished pride. He once said to her, "You see the world like it's something you can shape." She replied, "Because I have no one else to shape it for me." Alaric was drawn to her fire. Mirelle, to his gentleness. He wasn't like the other nobles she'd read about. He asked questions. He admired strength. And when he spoke of love, he did so in a tone that suggested awe, as though he couldn't believe someone like her wanted someone like him. They fell fast. But falling is easy when you don't see the cliffs ahead. When Alaric brought her to the Velander estate for the first time, the shift was instant. The manor was a fortress of frost, all marble and portraits and servants who never made eye contact. Gavrion, his father, greeted her not with welcome, but with evaluation. He looked her up and down like weighing an object for trade. "So," he said, "a cottage mistress. That's quaint." His mother, Lady Celine, was no better. Her smiles were paper-thin and perfumed. "A country girl," she whispered later to another guest, unaware that Mirelle could hear. Still, she tried. She wore the right gowns. She memorized court etiquette. She sat through dinner parties and asked the right questions. When Alaric proposed, she accepted not just because she loved him, but because she believed in them. She thought, surely, once they see how much I love him, they'll soften. She was wrong. Throughout the engagement, they offered polite resistance. Suggestions to postpone. Hints about inheritance. One aunt even asked, "Do village folks celebrate weddings with animal sacrifice, or just music?" Mirelle laughed it off. She was used to barbs. But what stung wasn't their cruelty, it was Alaric's silence. He never corrected them. Never stood up for her. When she asked, he'd say, "They don't mean it like that, or they'll come around." So Mirelle bore it alone. She handled wedding planning herself, determined not to owe them anything. She funded most of it from her savings. She chose every flower, every note of music. Not to impress, but to keep the day real, personal. Hers. And now, after all the work, the tears, the compromise, she found herself mocked at the altar of her love, by the very people who had never tried to know her. The night before the wedding, she'd considered calling it off. Her cousin Saren, a traveling herbalist, had warned her. Love isn't enough if one of you has to disappear to keep it alive. But Mirelle didn't want to give up. She wanted to believe love could bridge the distance. So she stayed. And she made one final decision. She tucked the deed to the cottage, her cottage, into a hidden pocket in her dress. She didn't know why. Only that part of her still needed to remember who she was, in case she forgot. And now, as the lantern swayed above her and Uncle Tavrin's invitation rang in her ears, she knew why. It was never just about belonging. It was about refusing to be erased. And that meant telling the truth. Not for them. For her. The garden had gone still. Not quiet, exactly, silence is never truly silent, but still in that deep, uncanny way that happens right before a storm or a revelation. Lanterns bobbed gently in the night air, casting shifting patterns of gold across stunned faces. Nobles sat frozen with half-lifted goblets, murmurs trapped in throats. Even the string quartet had faltered mid-tune, their bows hovering an inch above strings, waiting. Mirelle stood at the front of the gathering. Her wedding gown, woven from linen and starlight, rustled softly as the evening breeze teased its hem. In one hand she held the parchment, its red wax seal now broken. The deed. Her deed. The paper she had nearly left behind, believing it would never be needed. She hadn't planned this. But life, Mirelle had learned, rarely respects plans. Her fingers shook slightly, but her voice, when it emerged, did not. "I know many of you do not know me," she began, eyes sweeping across the garden. "And I suspect many of you believe you already do." There was no accusation in her voice, just truth, measured and unflinching. A few nobles shifted uncomfortably. Someone cleared their throat. "I've heard the whispers," she continued. "I've seen the glances. I felt the laughter when Lord Gabrion toasted my supposed ambitions." She paused. Her gaze lingered on Alaric's father, who now stared at her with the kind of stunned indignation that only comes when a woman dares to reply. "But I haven't come to scold. I've come to clarify." She raised the deed gently, letting it unfurl like a flag. "This is the ownership document to the home Alaric and I now share," she said. "A modest cottage beyond the river bend, some of you may have passed it without notice." She turned the document to face the crowd, though she knew they couldn't read it from where they sat. The land was purchased 3 years ago. The down payment came from savings earned over nearly a decade, teaching, transcribing, selling preserves at market, and working the forge alongside my father during the harshest winters. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The weight of her words settled like snow on stone. "The deed," she said, "bears only one name." She paused again, letting the silence stretch. "Mine." It wasn't a boast. It was a fact, quiet, powerful, and irrefutable. I paid the taxes. I maintained the roof through 3 floods and a fire. When the foundation shifted last spring, I moved the stones myself. When Alaric and I moved in together, it wasn't to his estate. It was into my home. Mirelle let the deed fall slowly back to her side. "I did not marry for gold. I do not need riches. I built my life stone by stone. I brought love to this union, not a ladder." Somewhere to her left, a woman, one of Alaric's many aunts, gasped softly, the kind of sound made when a mirror cracks in someone's chest. "I don't seek your approval," Mirelle continued. "But I will not allow you to write my story for me." She glanced at Alaric then. His face was pale, unreadable. He hadn't moved since she began. His wine sat untouched. His expression, not cruel, not even angry, was something far worse, uncertain. "And to those wondering why I share this now," she added, her voice softening, "it's not to humiliate anyone. It's to reclaim something. My place. My voice." Her fingers folded the deed again, tucking it back into the pocket at her hip. Her eyes searched the crowd. She saw faces, some skeptical, some ashamed, some oddly admiring. "You see, silence can keep the peace," she said. "But only for those already at peace. For the rest of us, silence is a cage." With that, she stepped back from the stand. No applause followed. No one clapped. Not because it wasn't powerful, but because power doesn't ask for praise. It just settles, undeniable. As she turned and made her way back to her table, the night resumed its sounds. Crickets chirped. Leaves rustled. Somewhere in the distance, a wine goblet was set down a little too firmly. But the laughter, the mockery, it didn't return. Mirelle's steps were steady. Her spine straight. And for the first time that night, she wasn't smiling for anyone's approval. She simply was, present, full, and entirely in her own skin. At her table, Uncle Tavrin offered her a single nod as she sat. No words. None needed. Alaric sat beside her, still unmoving. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't know you brought that." Mirelle turned to him, expression unreadable. "I didn't plan to use it." He looked down at his hands. His voice dropped to nearly a whisper. "I shouldn't have laughed." "No," she said simply. "You shouldn't have." There were no dramatics. No scene. Just a moment, raw and real. A turning point drawn not in raised voices, but in the absence of lies. The music began again, softly. Conversations resumed, slower, more cautious. Guests approached Mirelle throughout the night. Some offered hesitant congratulations. Others offered deeper things, hands on her arm, eyes full of new respect. Even those who had mocked her earlier seemed to be reckoning with something they couldn't quite name. Lady Selene left early. Lord Gavrion disappeared without a word. But Tavrin stayed, along with the village folk, those who knew her story, who had seen her rise from ink-stained fingers to fierce bride beneath the lanterns. Later that evening, as the stars blinked into view and couples began to dance, Mirelle sat in quiet reflection. Her heart still raced, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was release, like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. She hadn't intended to make a speech. She'd only meant to survive the night. But sometimes, a moment calls out, and if you're brave enough, you answer. She didn't raise her voice. She rose. And no one at that wedding, no matter their station, their surname, or their sneer, would ever forget the night a blacksmith's daughter reminded the nobility what true power looked like. The evening unfolded with a hesitant grace, like a play uncertain of its next act. After Mirelle's speech, the garden reception resumed, but something about it had changed. The shift wasn't in the decor or the music, which still whispered gentle melodies into the breeze. It wasn't in the wine or the food or the flickering lanterns above. It was in the air itself, the kind of stillness left behind after thunder. Conversations continued, but softer. Eyes met hers across the courtyard, no longer laced with dismissal or mockery, but curiosity. Some, shame. Others, something close to admiration. No one approached her immediately, not the nobles, at least. They weren't sure how to. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't flung insults or stormed off in tears. She'd simply stood and claimed herself, and that made them more uncomfortable than any tantrum would have. Alaric hadn't said much after his quiet admission, "I shouldn't have laughed." His words hung between them like a cracked mirror. He sat beside her, close but distant, as if he, too, wasn't sure where they stood now. She could feel him trying to understand the scope of what had changed. And Mirelle wasn't ready to guide him through it. Not yet. She needed space, not from him, but for herself. The first to approach was a woman named Eliane, a cousin of Alaric's who had always been polite but distant. Eliane knelt slightly to be at Mirelle's eye level, her hand brushing Mirelle's forearm with uncharacteristic gentleness. That was. She paused, clearly searching for the right word, incredibly brave. Mirelle nodded once. It was necessary. Eliane's eyes lingered on her face for a moment longer before she rose and disappeared into the mingling crowd. Slowly, others followed. A noble from a neighboring house gave her a respectful bow. A younger courtier whispered a soft well said. One even asked, quietly, if she might be willing to speak to his sister, who was being pressured into a match above her station. Each interaction was small, but they added up, like droplets filling a basin. Mirelle didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. But she did feel seen. Across the courtyard, Lord Gavrion was nowhere to be found. He had left, no grand departure, no thundering exit. Just vanished after her speech, like a stone sinking into the river. Good, she thought. Let him sit with it. Lady Selene remained a while longer, her smile tighter than ever. She didn't speak to Mirelle, though their eyes met once across the lantern light. There was no warmth in her gaze, but no contempt either. Only calculation, as if trying to reevaluate a woman she thought she had already categorized. That alone was a kind of victory. But the most complicated silence came from Alaric. He stayed by Mirelle's side through the rest of the evening, but his body language had changed. The casual ease was gone. Now, there was something uncertain in his posture, like a man finally seeing the depth of the sea he'd been floating on. When they returned to their shared cottage later that night, the silence followed them through the threshold. It wasn't cold, but it wasn't comfortable either. Mirelle stepped out of her gown and into a simple linen robe, her fingers carefully folding the wedding dress and placing it across a chair. It no longer felt like a symbol of a dream fulfilled, but a reminder of how much she had bent herself to fit into someone else's world. Alaric sat on the edge of the bed, his elbows on his knees. "I've been thinking," he began, voice quiet, "about what you said. About all of it." Mirelle didn't interrupt. "I let them mock you," he continued. "I stood there and laughed. Like it was easier to pretend I didn't hear the malice." She turned toward him. "Why? I don't know. Maybe I thought it would pass. That it wasn't worth the scene. Or maybe I was scared." He looked at her finally. "I wanted to believe they'd come around eventually. That if I kept the peace long enough, everything would smooth out. You were trying to make me invisible," she said softly. "So I wouldn't challenge their comfort." His head dropped. "I never meant to," he whispered. "But yes." The silence that followed wasn't angry. It wasn't even hurt. It was older than both. "I need to know something," Mirelle said, her voice calm. "Do you love me as I am? Or only when I'm convenient?" He looked up sharply. "I love you. All of you. I just didn't realize how much I've asked you to compromise." She nodded slowly, allowing the words to settle. "I won't do it anymore," she said. "Not for you. Not for anyone." "I know," he said. "And I don't want you to." She watched him carefully, not for lies, but for clarity. And what she saw in his eyes wasn't perfect understanding, but a readiness to try. "I don't know how to fix what I've let happen," he said. "But I want to learn." Mirelle didn't reach for him. Not yet. But she offered a small nod, the beginning of a bridge. "Then start by listening," she said. "Really listening." He did. That night, they didn't argue. They didn't make grand promises. They simply sat side by side in the dark, the deed resting on the kitchen table like a third presence in the room. Not as proof of ownership, but as a symbol of reclamation. In the days that followed, messages trickled in. Some from distant friends. Others from unexpected places, nobles who had attended the wedding and found themselves reflecting in the aftermath. Even Mirelle's mother, who had held back most of the evening, wrote her a letter that arrived 3 days later. "You were magnificent," it said. "I always knew you were strong. I just didn't know how brightly you could shine when no one gave you permission to." Tears welled in Mirelle's eyes when she read it, not from sadness, but from recognition. She no longer sought to be accepted by the Vellanders. If they came around one day, it would be on her terms. Not as a guest, not as a project, but as Mirelle, builder, owner, woman. She had been polite. She had been patient. She had tried to mold herself into something soft and acceptable. But that night under the lanterns, she had spoken with the weight of every quiet moment she had swallowed. And the marble facade of their judgment? It had cracked. Not shattered. Not yet. But cracked enough to let the truth in. Dawn arrived quietly, without ceremony. Sunlight slipped through the window panes of the stone cottage, warm and golden, gliding across the wooden floors and casting soft shadows on the woven rugs beneath Mirelle's bare feet. She stood in the kitchen, robe loose around her shoulders, hair still tousled from a night of restless sleep. Her fingers were curled around a chipped ceramic mug, steam rising from the spiced tea inside. Across the table sat the deed. Still folded, its wax seal long broken, its meaning utterly transformed. She stared at it, not with the fire of righteous anger or the raw ache of heartbreak, but with a slow, steady clarity. The kind that comes not in the heat of confrontation, but in the quiet that follows. The kind that whispers, "You did not imagine it. You did not exaggerate. And you did not owe them silence." Behind her, the floor creaked, soft, hesitant. Alaric entered, his tunic wrinkled, eyes heavy-lidded from a night of tangled thoughts. He didn't speak at first, only moved around the room carefully, as if not to disturb a new rhythm forming in the space. "Morning," he offered finally. Mirelle nodded. He poured himself a drink and leaned against the counter. "Didn't sleep much." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit, then." He did. The air between them wasn't bitter. But it was different. The way river water shifts after a storm, still water, but deeper now. More honest. "I've been thinking," he said after a pause, "about what it means to belong." She arched a brow slightly, waiting. "I've always moved through the world knowing I was born into belonging. My name, my blood, the land, it all came before me, laid out like a path." He looked up at her. "You had to build yours. Every step. Every stone." Mirelle didn't reply. He needed to say it. He needed to hear himself say it. "And I let my family treat that like it was less than," he said. Like your story was something to be hidden instead of honored. Still, she waited. I know it'll take more than an apology, he continued, but I want to start there. I am sorry. For the silence. For not protecting you when I should have. For laughing when I should have stood. She nodded slowly. I don't need a perfect husband, Alaric. I need one who will stand beside me when it counts. His throat bobbed. I know that now. She looked down at her tea, swirling the herbs with a wooden spoon. This doesn't mean we're fine. It means we've started. Maybe. He nodded once, solemn. They sat in silence for a while, the kind that wasn't strained, just thoughtful. Outside, the wind stirred the apple blossoms. A bird called from the roof. The world, it seemed, was moving forward. So would they, in whatever form that might take. Later that day, Mirelle stepped into her garden, barefoot, face bare, heart steady. The villagers who had known her since girlhood passed by the gate. One woman, old Gerda, smiled and offered a loaf of bread with a wink. For the woman who put the nobles back in their chairs. Others simply nodded, but with eyes that lingered a little longer. Not with pity. With recognition. And then came a letter. Delivered by hand, sealed with dark green wax, the Velander crest. Mirelle read it under the shade of the apple tree. The handwriting was sharp and slanted, unmistakably Gabriel's. It was short. Mirelle. What you did at the wedding was unorthodox. Disruptive. Bold. It reminded me very much of my own mother, though I never admitted that aloud. We may not agree on much, but I see now that you are not what I assumed. That is my failure to bear. Do not expect affection from me. But you have my respect. G. Velander. She folded it without emotion and tucked it away, not in a drawer of keepsakes, but between the pages of her accounting ledger, not a memory, but a transaction finally settled. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, the story of what had happened at the wedding began to drift beyond the noble circles. Not in a scandalous way, but quietly, with reverence. Women at the markets whispered it. Blacksmiths repeated it. Even traveling merchants referenced the bride with the deed. And young girls in the village looked at Mirelle with wide eyes, not because she had married a noble, but because she had remained herself while doing it. She began to write again, not letters or speeches, but a chronicle. A book of truths. Not a fairy tale, but something real. About dignity. About power. About love that does not require silence to survive. Alaric read the first few chapters one night by candlelight. When he finished, he didn't speak for a long time. You should publish this, he said at last. I will, she replied. When I'm ready. They shared a look, not the same as when they were young and dreaming, but something better. A look between equals. Mirelle didn't regret loving Alaric. But she did regret how much of herself she had tried to tuck away to make the love palatable to others. She wouldn't do that again. Not for anyone. She wore her voice now like a second skin. Not loud. Just unmistakably hers. And as the seasons turned, as apples ripened, as snow fell, as fire warmed the stone walls of their home, Mirelle remained who she had always been, the daughter of a blacksmith and a teacher, the keeper of her own name, the builder of a house, and the woman who stood, steady and unshaken, in a room that once asked her to sit quietly and smile. They would not ask her that again. Because now they knew. And more importantly, so did she.